This presentation was recorded at MVC Conf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com. JetBrains, the leading vendor of professional development tools, now offers a range of new products for .NET developers. In addition to ReSharper, the top-class productivity extension for Visual Studio, you can now use .cover to run coverage analysis for your applications, .trace to find performance bottlenecks, and use TeamCity and UTrack for a perfect combination of continuous integration and issue tracking software. Go to www.jetbrains.com for more information.
Okay, guys, in this session we have Jeremy D. Miller presenting on fubu MVC for ASP.NET MVC developers. Jeremy is Chief Software Architect at Dovetail Software, coolest ISV in Austin. Jeremy began his IT career writing shadow IT applications to automate his engineering documentation, then wandered into software development because it looked like more fun. Jeremy previously worked as a systems architect building mission-critical supply chain software for a Fortune 100 company and learned agile development practices as .NET consultant at ThoughtWorks, one of the pioneers of agile development. Jeremy is the author of the open-source Structure Map tool for dependency injection with .NET and the Storyteller tool for executable specifications in .NET. Jeremy's thoughts on just about everything software-related can be found on his blog, The Shade Tree Developer, at codebetter.com/blog/jeremy.miller, part of the popular CodeBetter site. Jeremy is a Microsoft MVP for C#. Okay, Jeremy, go ahead and get started.
Hi there. We'll just get this out of the way. I am a real hands-on developer, daily in and out. So I'm going to say that to get a little bit of credibility that I'm not a PowerPoint guy, and I will mess up on PowerPoint quite frequently during this talk. We'll just try to continue when it happens. All right, so we're at a good conference. We're at a great idea for a conference, a big online conference for the ASP.NET MVC framework and application. I'm very aware that this is not a fubu MVC conference, but all the same, I want to talk about the fubu MVC tool, how it differs from ASP.NET MVC, how I think our approach enables new opportunities that maybe get missed in ASP.NET MVC. I'm not going to talk a lot about how to get a fubu MVC application up and going. You can find that on Fubu Guides. Instead, what I want to talk about mostly is our approach, how it differs, how you might try to adopt some pieces of fubu MVC today for your ASP.NET MVC efforts. You've already heard all of that. The only thing that's pertinent maybe is the bottom two bullets. If you have questions later, my email is one of the easiest things to get online, but all the same, it's right there if you have any questions later. Okay, for those of you who aren't following us at all, fubu MVC, it's an effort that Chad Myers, Josh Flanagan, Robert Grayling, and several other people have undertaken. It is an alternative MVC web framework for .NET. The FUBU does stand for us, by us. We originally started at Dovetail Software with early betas of the MS-MVC framework. We weren't entirely happy with what we had. We thought there were some ways that we wanted to go that differed from the MS-MVC framework, and we started to build our own MVC framework specifically to support the efforts and the way that we wanted to work at Dovetail Software. That's where the for us, by us moniker comes from. Truth be told, it is a jab in the eye at MS-MVC, but I apologize, and it sounds kind of fun, and if you don't like us, you can always tell us to go FUBU ourselves. I really meant it to be the long-tail solution. If you're familiar with that phrase, we're not trying necessarily to be the most widely adopted framework for .NET web development. I don't think it's possible. I don't think we have any chance of it. But what I do want to see is that the few people who do use FUBU really like it. I don't want a least common denominator approach. I want something that's very good for the people who like to work the way we do. It is completely open source. It's hosted on GitHub under the BSD license. You can do anything with it. You can take pieces of the code. You can go steal classes, copy, paste classes, use it in any way, shape, or form you see fit. It's all good with me if you get any value whatsoever out of it. Because it is on GitHub, and GitHub does enable a very collaborative approach, we take a lot of pull requests from people outside of the project. GitHub makes it very easy for us to take community contributions. Part of the downside of for us by us, if you are considering adopting this at all, it is for us by us, which means I typically don't add things to Fubu unless we needed a dovetail, or someone else who happens to be working on a different project needs it. So it's not necessarily very complete feature-wise, but it does the things we need very well. And for example, almost all of our CRUD type forms are AJAX forms. So I just don't have a lot of stuff in there to support maybe a downgraded browser approach where you're not using a lot of AJAX. And you will see this come up. We do still use the routing module from ASP.NET. It works. It does exactly what we need to do. There is no good reason to write our own. Other than that, there are no binary dependencies on anything else from ASP.NET MVC. It does obviously still use ASP.NET itself, some of the core classes, HTTP context, all those things we've grown to love and despise and hate over the years. We do try really hard to tuck those away so that you just don't have to see them. There is no HTTP context wrapper business going on at any time, but it's still there if you need to get at it. So as I said, Fubu MVC in a lot of ways is a response to how we felt about ASP MVC at the beginning. Two and a half years ago, when we started the product that we work on at Dovetail, we had a choice. We actually had the ability to choose either Rails or to stay on the .NET platform. At the time, for various reasons, I don't entirely recall, we chose to stay on .NET. But all the same, we really liked the development experience of Rails, at least for the UI part, and I think we kind of missed that. We looked at some of the very early ASP.NET MVC samples, and there were things that we didn't really like. And granted, this has been 2 years. A lot of it has improved since then, but all the same, I'm still feeling pretty good with what the path we went down. So, the stuff we think is important. We want to reduce as much of the cruft of developing ASP.NET apps as possible. Ceremony would be anything that's not really terribly germane to the business problem you're trying to solve. You know, things like lots of attributes, XML configurations, squiggly brackets, type declarations, all that kind of code noise you have to do to either satisfy a framework's requirements or in the classic line, you're writing a lot of code just to make the compiler shut up and leave you alone. So we want to try to reduce that as much as possible. To that end, again, pulling the lesson from Rails, we want to allow you to use as many conventions and opinions as possible. We want defaults that make sense. We want conventions to just figure out things from your application, make you go faster so you don't have to do a lot of explicit configuration. And basically, any way possible, we can avoid having you type a lot, frankly. And also, we want your configuration to be as dry as possible. There are a lot of facts you have to specify. I have a controller action. There has to be a route that matches it. How do I get to it? How do I determine the URL? A lot of things that are very closely related that have to be configured in the system. It'd be nice if you could simply state the fact, this is what it is one time, and that one-time thing applies everywhere across the system. I'll get more into that when we get into how we handle routing determination and URL. But that was the major goal, was the don't repeat yourself aspect of Rails that we really liked. For our application needs, we build a large desktop or a large web application system that will be hosted on-premise, and every client wants their own special sauce. We've had to create all new pages, all new workflows, we've had to alter the way some web actions work in the system for clients. We've had to inject in content into our existing pages. We know we've had to apply, in the future, we know we're going to have to apply new security policies, all kinds of stuff. So the point here is, I'm trying to get at is, it was very important for us to make the framework code itself to be very composable and to be easily extensible. That's the goal. The mechanism that we're using to get there, as we see a little bit farther down, we try to stress very hard the idea of composition over inheritance. This is a means and not the end itself. Try to use things like the solid principles as just a kind of a guiding approach in how we structure the internals of FUBU. We want very tightly focused classes to do one and only one thing. We want them to be as loosely coupled from their neighbors and their collaborators as possible. The FUBU team has a very wide overlap with the core structure map IOC tool team, so we are pretty obsessive about using IOC tools. Here, it's not so much wanting to make structure map take over the world so much as when I'm inside of my web application stack, I want to rearrange things. I want to treat it like little Lego pieces. So to that end, and also because it frankly makes FUBU much easier to construct, it's what we call dependency injection turtles all the way down. Almost every single piece of FUBU MVC itself, its own internals, are controlled by your IOC container. So I can get at the FUBU pipeline itself. I can change the way it works. I can add things. I can remove things. I can bend it to my will so that I can handle things like customer extensions, or I can simply make it work the way I want to for my application. I think I'll get into this farther. I think FUBU does a better job than MSMVC does. We're an Agile shop. Most of us have been doing Agile for a long time. I think at this point in time, I don't think test-driven development is all that controversial. And even if you're not doing TDD or BDD, I think almost everybody is going to want to write some kind of automated unit tests. So I think this just goes without saying. We care a lot about testability, and then we also care a lot about emergent design. I'm not going to sit down and design out our entire system for 2 years worth of work. We simply don't have a predictable enough roadmap to do that. So I need to be able to get in and out of this application and constantly accrete new functionality into the system without having to break a lot of things. Again, to the solid idea, if you pick out the big O in solid, the open-close principle, I want to be open for extension, but I want to be closed for modification. It's very important that you should be able to make new stuff in your system without having to get into old code, change old code, and potentially break things. So that kind of drives a lot of the way that FUBU is structured. All right, and then lastly, and I swear I'm about to get into the code finally, we want to make positive use of static typing. FUBU is very C# centric. I guess it's technically possible to use with VB.NET. I think you have to say that Ruby on Rails is the shining darling of web development frameworks now. And at least in the circles I travel in, there's almost an unspoken assumption, or I guess it's very much spoken, that languages like Ruby and tools like Rails give you much more productivity than you can get with using any kind of a static type language. I guess I'm sure that many of you disagree with that. I'm not sure how I fall down on the case, but I'm also kind of thinking that much like the way dynamic languages were castigated a couple of years ago as being too slow, the last couple of years we've seen people actually try to optimize languages like JavaScript, and now we see very, very fast JavaScript engines like the Google V8 and the new IE9 engine. What I think happened was, over all these years, nobody actually tried to see how fast they could make a dynamic language until recently. By the same token, I think there's a lot of tricks we can do with static typing to make ourselves go faster. They're different tricks than what you can do with Ruby. So we use a lot of reflection in Fubu. We have a very rich type system in .NET, and there's a lot of ways we can take advantage of that to determine how the application is supposed to work. So instead of you having to specify, this is how I display, instead of you explicitly saying, okay, I'm going to display a date by formatting it in this way, we can just simply teach Fubu to know, if I have a date, I display it this way, and not have to think about it anymore. Any questions before I go on? And please do feel free to ask questions either through the Q&A and moderator, however you want to do it. I can't see the IRC chat, so I would ask that if you have questions, either blurt it out or do it through the Q&A.
I'm not seeing any questions. You're good.
Might have them too bored. This is all background information here, but I still want to talk about it just to kind of bring out the differences here. This isn't stuff you're going to have to deal with on a daily basis, and it kind of suck if you had to. But let's bring it up right off the bat. So somebody enters a URL into the browser, and this is roughly what's going to happen. The routing engine catches it. It figures out which route it's going to be. So far, so good. It's exactly the same. Every route has a reference to the Fubu route handler. That's our little custom route handler. Routing engine's very easy to plug into. It was actually pretty nice to work with. So, it asks the route handler, hey, give me the HTTP handler, and then turns right around and tries to process the request. Just coincidentally, the Fubu route handler is also the HTTP handler. Once the route handler is kind of taken over, it has all the information about the request and the route. It goes to something called the behavior factory and says, hey, give me the behavior for this particular route, and here's all the request details, all the HTTP context scoop. Behavior factory is a light wrapper around an IOC tool. Today, strangely enough, we only support structure map, but we obviously have plans to support other IOC tools. The behavior factory, it sets up, well, I guess I'll get into it. It sets up a nested container. It hands back the behavior you want that matches the request, and then you just simply invoke it. It's nothing too dramatic here, nothing that different. What is different here? Fubu MVC is very definitely built as what Fowler identified as the front controller. So one big honking controller in front of every single request that reads the request and then decides what command or commands, plural, to run from there. In our case, the front controller, it's just the routing module. It works. Like I said, there's no reason for it to do it. The commands are behaviors in this case. We have one of the ways that Fubu does different with ASP.NET MVC is we do register a specific handler for every single route. We don't use generic routes, the controller name / method / ID. We don't use that pattern. We actually create a separate route for every single URL endpoint. I'm actually not sure what the performance implications of that are, but it gives us a lot of advantages and flexibility on how we handle things. Now, what's not there, if you're an NSMVC user, there are no controllers per se. I'll have to talk about that in detail. There are no action results. There are no action filters. There are only behaviors. One of the big difference, I've hit this over and over again, but through the talk I'm going to try to explain why we think this is advantageous. We leverage an IOC container to put stuff together. I think IOC containers get a knock as something you just use for testability. I think that's leaving out a big piece of the story. One of the things you use an IOC container for is really to act as a composition engine to put the right pieces together. We can actually set up our IOC container so it knows about the current route, the request data, everything that people need, and then we use the IOC container's built-in capabilities to push stuff to all the pieces of the code that need it. I don't have to write a lot of code like you would find in the controller base class in MSMVC, where I have to push model state around, where I have to push this context, that context, whatnot. I can just use what's in the IOC tool out of the box. So real quickly, I'm going to dive into code for just a second. I don't know, we need to be in this too long. So as I'm starting up an HTTP request, we wrap this code right here. I think somebody's already done it, but I'm going to do the John Madden boom sooner or later in this talk. This aggregate dictionary wraps up all the request data, all the stuff, the routing dictionary, the form dictionary, all that kind of stuff. I don't know that there's that many places you want to get at it raw, but you could. This is all in there. Invoking and grabbing the behavior, the one behavior I need. And all it does is invoke. Okay. So it's all about behaviors these days. That's all there is. You know, some guy that looks a lot like Chevy Chase with big fake teeth is going to show up on your fubu project, and he's going to start talking about these behavior things. You may not know what they mean, but it's our one-size-fits-all solution to everything. The behavior model gives us a way to have a completely composable request pipeline. And it turns out to be really valuable. There is no set pattern in fubu that says you must have a controller method, a view, and then stuff around it. Any possible way you want to compose up this pipeline to have some behaviors that might do security checks. You might have more than one logical controller action in the pipeline. So you can technically call all the controller actions you want, and then tag on any kind of output behaviors you'd like. Render a view, output to JSON, do some continuation like logic. If the such and such entity requested can't be found, instead of continuing on to the view, maybe instead you return a 404. Maybe you return a custom message. You can do basically everything. And my colleague Chad Myers likes to describe it as the behavior model as it's kind of like decorators, but it's not. It's kind of like a chain of responsibility, but it's not. I think from now on I want to use the Russian nesting doll architecture to describe it. Now, out of the box, we can do all the very basic things you're going to want to do. To get a lot of power, you're probably going to write some of your own behaviors, especially when you're talking about things like security or wrapping or logging or transactional management or who knows what you're going to do. So let's take a look at what it looks like. The iAction behavior interface. It's pretty exciting, right? Invoke partial. I'm not going to talk a lot about partials today. Partial just means maybe on a view page, maybe on a view page you just say render the contents of this controller action. So you actually invoke a partial request, kind of an embedded request. In other cases, maybe you're kind of doing what we call jumping the track. You get a request in, and based on whether something's valid or not, you go left or you go right, and you actually jump over to a completely different behavior chain. I'm going to leave it at that. It's just too far to go into today. But the big thing here is, if you see where my cursor is, there's no arguments to the invoke method. There's nothing we're passing in. There's no controller context, no nothing. We don't have to push anything in. If your iAction behavior needs something, just declare it in your constructor function. This is all built up by an IOC tool. The IOC tool will put everything together. It'll handle the scoping. It'll give you the correct request. It'll give you the right model information, everything you need. You always can write an iAction behavior directly, but I think the vast majority of times, you can start with our basic behavior class as a super class. This is just a straight up template pattern that's going to help you kind of bring things together. Do you remember when I said this was a nested Russian doll problem? Your behavior can have an inside behavior. So think of it as the next behavior along the chain, but that's not quite right in a way. What we do in the invoke is you're going to do whatever it is your behavior does. And you're going to return a value that says, do I go on or do I stop? And if you have an inside behavior, assuming it's continue and you have an inside behavior, now you can invoke that inside behavior and do whatever it does. But you also get a chance to go to do something after that inside behavior. So jumping over, I'm going to look at a little bit at Dovetail, our own Dovetail code, because I'm lazy and it was a fast way to do this. In this particular case, I am just going straight at the interface. It does have a partial. This is a behavior we use just to log who's doing what in our system. You know, the very basic. Somebody hits this URL. Just tell us which URLs are getting hit, right? And also, you know, while you're at it, log some failures. Now, this is where the behavior, I think you see some of the power of the behavioral model. Here's the inner behavior. So this would be call an action, you know, get an output model, render a view. But all of the execution of the rest of the pipeline is inside of this try-catch block, this try-catch finally block, so that on any kind of execution failure, we get to wrap the whole thing and we can catch it and we can log it. Okay. Maybe to make this be a tiny bit cooler, in the fubu application for controller actions that would spawn a logical transaction, we manage our in Hibernate session lifecycle in a container, what we call the transactional container behavior. Going to maybe reformat this code a little bit to make it more readable. So when this behavior is executed, it's a little goop of our side. Behind the scenes, this method that's highlighted here, it's opening an in Hibernate session. It's creating a new structure map nested container that's then pushed around to everything else. Oh, that's not what I want. Maybe this is a little better. All I'm trying to show you here is that for things like in Hibernate session scoping or transaction management, you can create a behavior that's on the outside of the other behaviors, and it can completely invoke the internal behavior inside of a using block, the try-catch block, whatever it's going to be. We're going to argue that that's a little bit cleaner way to manage these kinds of operations, as opposed to using a lot of HP modules to, you know, off events, start a session, close it down at the end. And it also makes it very simple for us to use something like nested containers to manage the scope of services through a web request. By pushing it down this way, your session this way, you can use a straight-up dependency injection, straight constructor injection to get things like the in Hibernate I session, repositories, whatever it's going to be. You don't have to worry about going to some kind of locator. You don't have to say, all right, go to the HP context if it exists, find the session off of the HP context variable, wherever it is. Just let the container handle it. Your classes become much simpler. Show this real quick. So here's a relatively simple controller for us, the Avatar's controller. All he really has to do is just declare in his constructor function, I need the iRepository. iRepository has the Hibernate session in it internally. Avatar's controller doesn't have to care where the iSession is coming from, where it's scoped, anything like that. Just open it up in its constructor function, and it gets the exact right one that allows it to be on the same session as everything else in the HP request. Okay. No matter what ORM you use, whether you're using Entity Framework, Link to SQL, in Hibernate, whatever, subsonic, whatever it's going to be. One of the first things you learn when you're doing a web application is you have to manage the life cycle of your session, your data context, whatever it is, so that every piece of the request pipeline is handling it. We think that Fubu, by being dependency injection turtles all the way down, makes this a little easier than MSMVC. So we've got all the basic stuff, the very, very basic things. JSON endpoints, downloading a file, outputting string, outputting HTML with the MIME types set right, and all that good stuff. The very common things are out of the box. You can use them as you go. We've found it valuable to create some of our own custom behaviors, things like transactional management. In some cases, we use custom behaviors to enrich a model. Say your controller action creates some kind of view model that's supposed to be sent to a view. We can create a behavior that takes the output from the controller action and adds customer-specific data or adds navigation model data, stuff that you could be reusing across controller actions. So it comes out to be a great way to share code across controller actions and also to kind of modularize the pipeline. We looked at that sample. We looked at that sample. I'm running low on time. I'm going to skip that. Any questions about behaviors before I go on?
There's nothing in the chat room.
Sweet. The great thing about behaviors is they're there if you need them. You shouldn't have to worry about them at all most of the time. So let's move on. What does the C in Fubu MVC look like? It's a little bit of a loaded question. We don't technically have controllers. You can call them controllers. You can use them in that way. But we don't really require any set pattern. Oh, hey, I'm sorry. Scott Kuhn in the house posting questions. Let me ask this real quick before I get into this too deep. Scott asks, is it fair to characterize Fubu MVC in this way? It turns structure map into a servlet container, and then all incoming requests are sent to the IOC container. Sort of. I never really thought of that. Structure map is kind of a passive thing. It's just helping us put things together. Yeah, I'll have to think about that one, Scott. Kind of. Any more questions I can answer in a really lame way? You just put them right in there. So, the controller actions. We've been talking about this for a couple of years, starting with KaizenConf in late 2008. We like this pattern we call the one model in, one model out pattern. And Fubu is more or less hardwired for it, at least at the moment. Fubu wants you to make all your actions, take in one model object, and return one model object. And wherever you see one, substitute in 0 or 1, 0, 0 or 1 in, 0, 1 out. We don't like controller actions that have multiple arguments. We actually like to use the input model as kind of a named endpoint. When I get into URL resolution, probably in the next hour, I'll show you how we take input models and use that as like a living URL. We can go straight from an input model to a URL. The one model out, we don't have action results in Fubu. I thought they were going to be in there. They were in very early versions. When we kind of codified and standardized on the behavior model, they disappeared. Your controller action doesn't have to return a view result, a JSON result, any of that kind of stuff. I like this model, and I wanted to go this model right off the bat because I thought the action result thing was just kind of a lot of repetitive, unnecessary ceremony code. I didn't like the early examples of, well, here, I'll just put them on the spot. I didn't like the early CodeCamp server type samples I saw. It looked like it was a lot of feeding in the framework. So we want to streamline our controllers, and we think it makes it a lot more testable. So you don't have to do that monotonous, go find the inner model and the view result kind of thing every time. I think the POCO actions have some other advantages. You know, I talked about being able to potentially enrich models before they get to the view, to insert stuff between your controller action and the view. We found that to be valuable. We know we're going to have customer-specific extensions coming up soon where we do that same kind of thing. I think it makes it more reusable. One of the points for me of wanting to do this originally was to be able to support and reuse our controllers out of the box in our mobile app versus our normal heavy web client app. And I know what you're saying. You can just do that with a separate view engine. But in our case, we want to take controller actions that are JSON-enabled AJAX services in the main app and actually have them return and render a view in a totally different circumstance in the mobile. Having the composable behaviors with POCO actions makes that a lot easier. A lot of people I know were for a while, were gung-ho on the idea of a class per action. I like that pattern better than grouping related actions by controller. Fubu doesn't care. You can do both. Bum, bum, bum. KevDog, answering a question real quick. I understand where you think Fubu is better. Where do you think ASP.NET MVC is superior? Well, that's outside the scope of the talk. MVC, the ASP.NET MVC framework is obviously much better documented. It's much better known. There is a wider community, you know, as shown by the fact there's 1,000 people registered for this conference. The integration with Visual Studio, obviously we can't match. I'm not sure I entirely care. The specifics, there's little points you may like with MVC better than ours. I don't really know. I'll have to write a blog post about that later. I'm sorry. And number two, what are the advantages of using IOC for composition over MEF, over MEF? You're going to get me an angry phone call from Glenn Block after this. There's a lot of things that MEF still doesn't do around lifecycle management. Last I knew, MEF wasn't, still didn't have the idea of things like HTTP context scoping and request scoping. The biggest thing for me, it's not really that IOC is better than MEF here, is there are a lot of features we use with the IOC tool that in Fubu that don't exist in MEF yet. Things like being able to poke explicit things through. And some of it is I just don't see an advantage of MEF. If you're starting a whole new application, my one piece of very strong advice with MEF is you go 100% MEF or you go 100% IOC. I would not try to mix and match, even though they say that's possible. I think that's going to be I think that's going to make your system hurt. There's going to be too much complexity, fighting with two totally different ways of configuring all this stuff. That's worth a blog post someday, though. All right. I want to look at it, just to bring this home, I want to look at a few quick examples. And we looked at Avatar Controller here. Avatar's Controller. I cherry-picked this because it's a pretty simple one for us. As you might be able to see, I'm not particularly concerned about a class having more than one or two dependencies. If your services are very small, and you're not finding yourself doing a lot of duplication, I don't really think it hurts anything. It's just my opinion. What's important about Avatar's controller here is what's back here. All you see is an interface. And I think the only reason the interface exists is another service, another controller is using Avatar's controller. Yeah. So that's done to decouple it from another controller. But what you don't see is any base class. I don't know, I'd call them completely POCO, but it has no dependency on fubu whatsoever. Well, okay, I lied. It uses the download file model. By returning the fubu download file model here, that it kind of tells fubu to treat this like a download, and it actually attaches a behavior onto the end of it. Here's another one. Okay, so now this isn't as pretty as a Ruby DSL, but this is something I'm actually kind of happy with. This is a little C# internal DSL we use for what we call routing. A lot of actions on the UI. We might have a button where you say, I'm in a case page, and I want to assign this case to someone else. So there's kind of a stair step of potential steps we take. You know, if the item you're looking at, if you don't actually have permission to do something, you don't get to do it. All kinds of things. But this action router, we have conventions that can go scan all these action routers in our assembly and automatically set them up as controller actions, create routes for them, and get them tied into our system. And that's kind of a nice thing. This assign router has no base class to a controller. I don't have to do anything special. The point is I can make my actions look like anything I want to. All they have to be able to do is do the one model in, one model out. All right. I forgot to do the sample. Before I talk about model binding, or I think it's probably that time to take the 5-minute break maybe between talks. But just to close down the behaviors, maybe show you a little bit about how they do fit together. I meant to do this in my notes and forgot to. So here is a dovetail application. It looks a lot better in higher resolution, or you'll have to take my word for it. So let's look at what the potential things look like. I'm going to talk about the diagnostics in the next hour quite a bit, but for right now, let me just show you what some of them look like. So the more typical things we do, let me find one that has, let me find one that does a view. Okay. So this view here is showing us all the possible routes in the system. So it's telling us the action, if there are any, and they could be plural. Like this is calling the cues controller, it's calling the edit method, this is the signature, again, one model in, one model out. That's what we're putting in, this is what's coming out, this is what's being rendered, and there's an ugly GUID. But drilling into the ugly GUID, I can look for this one route, I can see all of the behaviors that apply here. With a little bit of extra stuff, you know, what kind of behavior it is, a little bit of a description, the actual type. The stuff that's grayed out here, that's junk that fubu is putting in for diagnostics, and I'll talk about that later. This stuff wouldn't show up in real production mode. So this particular request, We wrap it with something we call the safe mode behavior. That's to handle pop-outs. We put that action logger behavior before everything. We do some stuff to localize it. That shouldn't be there. There's actually calling the controller itself. The controller's called, pushes this thing in. This is resolved from the input automatically, fed to the Q's controller. The output model comes out, and that's stored in something called the fubu request that I'll get into next hour. Before it gets to the view, we get at this edit Q view model, and we take a look at what the subject is. You know, there's a Q. We actually have a model object called Q in there. It looks at the Q, and from the Q and the current user and all that good stuff, the menu strip enrichment behavior can add a navigation model. These are the available actions that this user can do on this Q model entity thing. And then finally, all the stuff is done. It goes to a view page. We're using the web forms engine, which I don't recommend. And takes this model that was produced up here, it's pushed into the view itself, and this thing renders it like normally, and then it comes back up the stack. So this guy gets a chance to look at it afterwards, up and up and up until it's all done. All right, I think I'm gonna call a break right here and pick up in 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
I think I'm ready to get going again, but I've got a couple questions backed up. I'm going to try to hit first. When I do jump back in, I think from the commentary I've heard otherwise, we're going to go a lot more code-centric. We're going to get off of the philosophical junk and do go into real code. So let's see. Let's take questions first. I had a question about the view engine support. Specifically asking about alternative view engines. Fubu has supported Spark for quite some while now. Robert Grayling, that's going to be speaking on Spark later today, I know is going to talk about the Spark integration with Fubu, and he's the major person behind Spark on Fubu anyway. I know the samples I'm showing today are all in web forms because we made what I think may turn out to be a short-sighted decision to stay on web forms. But no, Fubu is not hard tied to web forms at all. You can use Spark, and if you're starting from a greenfield project, I think you probably want to do that. I think Razor looks like a pretty decent choice too. I'm not sure I would say it's better than Spark though, but yes, it does do other web forms engines, other engines. Had another question about the JavaScript jQuery part of the side. I think I'm going to have to. Red Square, I think I'm going to have to put that off to a blog post. I got to collect my thoughts on it. I can definitely talk about how we've done things, though. Here, I'm copying that off right now. Can't promise when I'll get to it, but I'll try soon. All right. I know I'm starting to hurt a little bit on time. I've got a lot more content to get through than I possibly can. I'm probably going to skip over a few sections. I'm trying to concentrate on the sections of the parts of Fubu that you could use as is in MVC. So I may skip over some other things. If you're interested about it, maybe ping me later, and I'll try to get back on, try to remember how to use my blog engine again. Get some stuff going there. All right, I'm going to start with model binding. You should be familiar with this from MSMVC anyway. We're very much a believer in one model in, one model out. We don't want our controllers to be bound to the framework in any way possible. definitely don't want your actions, controllers, whatever you want to call them, you definitely don't want them to have any concept or any coupling whatsoever to the actual HTTP runtime. And tight coupling, I think using something like the old HTTP context wrapper or the forms collection, like you saw in MSNBC in the early days, that definitely qualifies as very tight semantic coupling. So all I want, especially for testability, my controller should just be given a model object. So we got to figure out how to make that happen. The one place, I guess, where model binding differs from fubu to MSNBC, besides the fact that fubu's model binding has absolutely nothing to do with validation, fubu's model binder is very modular, very extensible. Without having to do a complete replacement of the model binder, you can kind of inject all new behavior into the model binder. So you got a couple different ways to extend it. You can, you know what, I'm just going to go to the code. So the main guy is something called Object Resolver. There's a default implementation in Fubu itself. Again, because Fubu is all IOC'd itself, you could actually override the iObject resolver in Fubu with something you like. And I think I might show an example of doing that if we had more time. So at some point, when Fubu determines you need to see some model object and it doesn't know about it from the first time, it's going to try to resolve that object with that given type from the current request. These interfaces, request data, and the fatter thing binding context, this is Fubu internals you shouldn't have to see, but these are lightweight adapter interfaces that hide the HTTP internals, the ASP.NET internals away from you. I guess just for fun. There's what iRequest data looks like. So it's the same kind of thing I think that MSNBC does. It's a stair-stepped evaluation. I just ask for a value. Everything's a dictionary, a key, and a callback for the value if it exists. If you'll pardon the pedantry, this is continuation passing style. If the request data finds the key that you asked for, it'll call you back with whatever the object was. So it'll look through the routing variables, it'll look through query string, the form collection, and then farther into HTTP header keys and files and however far it needs to go into. So object resolver, yeah, I'm not real happy about that. I think I'll write a blog post about that, and I'll try to explain why that's there, and we can talk about alternatives. The key point here is you can create model binding policies. You know, I apply if you see this property. I apply to this type of thing, and those policies can get a hold of the current container and grab any kind of services they need to do other things. So think of a scenario where, for us, I guess, like a lot of teams, we have a layer super type for all our entity classes. So our case, our solution object, our side object, contact, contract, all that kind of stuff. They all derive from a common layer super type, mostly to get very basic things like identity properties and last modified, that kind of junk that you see on every one of your domain model entity. What we can do, though, is we can say that anytime I have a anytime that I have an entity object on an input model, it's going to come up as the GUID, the string representation of the GUID. But actually, I could create a value converter or teach fubu to say, if you see a property that derives from entity, what I want you to do is to take that string value, go find the repository, has to do service location to do this, and go find that object right then and there. Go look it up from the database and then put it onto the target input model. So that's why service, I'm going to hit that in a little more detail, but that's why service locator's there, in case you're freaking out about why we're doing service location after preaching dependency injection so hard. I'm not entirely happy with it. So the object resolver, it's not the model binder itself. There is a standard model binder, or the default model binder, that is very modular, that can do almost everything. But say that you need a special model binder that does something totally wacky and different from everything else. So you can do that same kind of almost pattern matching approach. So you can register new model binders that first get to say, this is what I do. The model binder can look at the type being requested that you know right off the bat and say, yeah, I know how to handle this one. So it's a little bit like a chain of responsibility. Object resolver works by finding first, what's my binder? So go grab the model binder that matches the model type I'm looking at. So I can throw more of these things into my IOC container. I'll get pushed through, and I get a chance to intercept it. If I wanted to take entities in our Dovetail code, if I want to take entities as an input model, I could probably register a custom model binder that would just take a string from the route and go look it up from the repository and return that. So it's totally bypassing the standard model binding. But we never actually found a reason to need that yet. So let's look at the standard model binder. The standard model binder, it matches any class that has a default no argument constructor. I guess that's kind of a limitation right now. Maybe we'll get it fixed at some point. So the way it works is it grabs whatever model object you're looking at. Let me find one here. Okay. So let's say we're working with avatars again, and I'm trying to post an updated avatar. We do think our system is probably going to be used by a lot of younger people who are working in support organizations, just to make me feel old and say younger people. So they're going to go home, they're going to get their new video game, and they're really going to want to replace their boring avatar with, picture of the new StarCraft II characters, right? So they're going to update their avatar. They're going to do something on the UI. This object more or less is going to get posted up. When the model binder gets it, the standard model binder, it's going to say, okay, I need to do avatar change request view model. And the next thing it's going to do is it's going to look for all the properties on this view model. It's going to see two. So inside of itself, it knows about all the properties. No. And again, in case you're sitting there scared about all the complexity, This is stuff you don't have to do very often, but it's awfully nice. If you do want a custom behavior in the model binding, you can do it. So now it knows about every property. It looks so, scans over every property, and it sees, I want to find the property binder that knows how to deal with that property. Again, you see this pattern come up over and over and over again inside of FUBU, the matches and do kind of pattern. It's a little bit like a chain of responsibility, but it's very container friendly. So you can just pop as many of these things in your container as you want. It'll all get pushed into the internal model binder. So there is a basic property binder. So just looking here at the stuff that's already embedded inside of FUBU. So FUBU knows some properties are just ignored. You can mark them with an attribute. We have to give up and use attributes sometimes. If it's a complex object of some kind, like you have a model that has a submodel or some kind of value type on it, some kind of other DTO, a hierarchical complex object. It knows to basically send that back into the model binder and handle the hierarchy all the way down. And then very basic things, strings, numbers, dates, whatever you can think of. There's a basic one called the conversion property binder. So I can plug in an iProperty binder, but it's also, oops, not a yes. I can also plug in with this idea called a value converter. So just an idea that you can, without getting into specifics too much, I can teach FUBU how to convert an object, the raw object coming off the request, into whatever the target type is. And it does this. It does have full access to the property, the raw value, the object itself, everything you could possibly need to make a decision. So let's say that you have custom logic about how you handle dates. Dates have been a kind of a nasty problem for us. Okay. This is our own internal bootstrapping of FUBU. So this is where we have gotten in and modified the way that the model binder works for Dovetail specific stuff. One of the big headaches in our system has been date times and how we handle UTC conversion. You know, the standard, I did something in Central Time, and then a guy from Hong Kong logs in, and they should now be able to see the log of when you did something in their own local time, so they understand when. So, you know, there's a lot of hokey pokey that happens to convert times to UTC and then back into standard time. So as we do model binding, it takes the input that's coming up from the client. I won't get into this code too much. But it takes the content coming in from the client and it converts it to UTC time based off the time zone that the user says they are. It just handles this directly in model binding. The obvious value for us being here is once I set this up in our CIDR model binding, never have to worry about it again. All we've done here is, without changing any FUBU code, we simply changed the policy for how FUBU converts dates, how FUBU converts the raw HPT input coming up from the client, how that gets converted into a date time. That's been hugely advantageous to us. So that's for the converters. I did say that you can also tie in at property binders. So here's a trick we're using pretty frequently that I'm really happy with right now. Let's say that you want to put contextual information on your input models that aren't necessarily tied to HPU request data coming up. For us, we have a lot of actions that need to work off of who's the currently logged in user. So they actually need the entity object for the current user. It's not on the principal itself, so we don't have that shortcut. We can look at the principal and see what the user ID is and go look it up. But you kind of see where this is going. There's a lot of repetitive hokey pokey of go invoke this one little service, go look up what the current user is off the principal, go find it from the repository and get me the entity object. It happened over and over and over again. So what we do now, we have a little convention. Let me find an example real quick. Just cheat. Okay, so let's say we have some kind of controller action, special action, terminate user, and he takes it in this view model. Somewhere inside of this action, I need to know what the current user is. Right? It's pretty obvious. A lot of places you need to log what user did stuff. I think it's pretty easy to understand why we want to. So we have a convention now that we built in fubu where we just say that any property of type user that's named current user on an input model, just go look up what the current user is and just fill this model. So that functionality is what you see here in our current user binder. So when fubu is getting at the special input model and it's looking at all the properties here, this will never show up anywhere in the form post or an AJAX message or anything like that, but we can still teach the fubu model binder how to deal with it. So the current user binder looks at the property that you're trying to bind and says, if it's user and the property.name is this current user, it says, hey, it waves its hand. It's like the little brown-noser kid in class. Hey, I know how to do this. I can answer this. So it's picked up from matches, and then in its bind, you can actually go and invoke a service, grab a service off the fly, and say, give me the current user, and set that property. Any questions on that before I think I move off of model binding?
I don't see any.
All righty. All right, I'm trying to be mindful of the time, so I might pick up and go a little faster. I think some of this is going to get skipped. I think I'll do blog posts about this at some point in time. I don't have validation integrated tightly into the model binder, but I can show you to kind of demonstrate where the composition thing actually matters. How we can very easily integrate validation into model binding without changing any single piece of fubu. Oh. Red Square is asking, do you not cache the current user, or do you always go to the DB? Which user it is cached by a cookie. You know, the standard principal, set the principal up on every request if you're already authenticated. That normal process. We almost have to go and look up the user every time. I guess we could go to an Hibernate second level cache, but you need the user to be in from the current session, so you don't get all the normal errors of having entities crossing sessions and stuff like that. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through this a little bit and get on to mostly the HTML conventions for the rest of the talk, because I think that's the one single thing that you could get the most bang out of for an ASP.NET project. But you probably should be wondering a little bit, you show me all these little behaviors and all these pieces, how do I get them grouped together? How do I actually activate things? There is some information on the Fubu or on guides.fubumvc.com that'll probably tell you at least enough to get started, but I'll at least show you real quick. And again, I know that this is a little bit ugly. We are working to simplify this, but your Fubu application starts from the Fubu registry. If you're familiar with structure map, it is very analogous to the registry. It's if you're going to be pedantic, it's what Fowler calls the object scoping pattern. But it's a way for us to create a little unit of Fubu MVC DSL. One of the criticisms I would kind of throw at the MSMVC framework is I don't think they have a cohesive configuration story. One of the things I very much like is trying to bring things like policies and configuration and try to put that in the smallest surface area you can, but put it all together, with the hope being that you can scan one small piece of code or configuration and know what all the pieces are on the application. This one's this is what we use in Dovetail. It's a little ugly because Fubu doesn't yet have that method yet. If we had the very basic conventions just baked in out of the box, already set up, most of this I think would go away. Now, what we can do with this Fubu registry, we can set a lot of policies and conventions for things like, I think I can auto-discover actions. I can tell Fubu how to determine routes. Given an action, here's what the route needs to be for that action. So use things like namespaces, controller names, action class names, method names, whatever you want to do. You can teach Fubu how to go from that action that's been auto-discovered in step 1 and then turn it into a route. The way that we work at Dovetail, maybe we're not as paranoid as we should be about how pretty the URLs are. So we're getting by with just letting Fubu determine the routes for the actions for us automatically and locking those together. It is all kind of a configuration model. Conventions, explicit config, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of what I think of as the stir-fry architecture. All right. I get home, a little bit late from work some nights, got to cook supper, not really organized enough maybe to do things right. So I like the one skillet meal. Just grab whatever vegetables I have and chop them all up and throw it in a big pan and stir fry it. So to some degree, Fubu MVC is a little bit like that. There's a model, a configuration model I'm going to have to skip over, where you say, this is all the things I want. These are the actions. These are the routes. This is how a route ties to an action. This is the behaviors that are going to be behind the action, in front of it, handling it. Everything that Fubu is going to need to do. The cool thing about having a configuration model like that is we can work off of almost any kind of configuration approach you want. If you want to start from saying, here's a flat file of how I want every URL to look, and then create a policy that matches those URLs to the action, to the logical actions, so that you have maximum control over the URLs, you can do that. Fubu doesn't care as long as that model the configuration model is built and then baked into the application. But inside this Fubu registry, I can also do things like I can say these actions should be wrapped with a transactional container. Like we might say any action that is a post should automatically get transaction semantics around it. You might put authorization rules around every single route. For us, there's some stuff built into Fubu. It can actually recognize some types of model objects and know, yeah, this is always output and input is JSON. It's an AJAX service. So I can specify auto-discovery of actions. And yes, I'm very, very painfully aware this part's ugly. How to get routes, how to get URLs out of it. I can specify some more conventions. Conventions can be either defined in line with DSL, or you can actually reuse your own convention classes. How to decide which views are attached to which actions. Again, this is shown on guides.fubumvc.com. Here's the one that's probably more fun. So let's have what we call a policy. I'm using the terms convention and policy separately. They're almost the same thing, or they're the exact same thing mechanically inside of Fubu. The only difference is when they're executed. Conventions run first, then any kind of explicit configuration, and then policies at the end. So let's say you've discovered your actions, you've applied and determined routes to them, you've attached views, handlers, you've figured out which ones are going to be JSON endpoints or XML endpoints or HTML endpoints. And then at the end, you can do something called policies, where you can still go into that kind of configuration model and you can say, wrap any behavior chain with this particular behavior if it matches this criteria. So like an example policy you would be saying is find every possible endpoint that's a post and wrap that with a transaction behavior, right? So you might say that anything that's a get shouldn't have a transaction because it shouldn't be modifying any data, in theory. And that anything that's a post implies that things are going to be modified. So let me just automatically set up a transaction. And then more easily, you can simply just wrap any behavior chain. Just say, put this behavior in front of everything. That's what you see here. That's a slightly special one. This puts the menu strip enrichment behavior. This is the one I was saying that if I open a case page or a solution page or any entity in our system that has contextual actions associated with it, This will put a behavior between the action and the view that gives me the ability to inject in what actions are available. So that's kind of a nice thing. All right. So I know I blew through that pretty fast, but I think I'm going to go on to the next one. I'll answer any questions as soon as I see them pop up, if that's okay. You can get into the one model in, one model out. The bigger difference, I think, between fubu and what you might be used to with MSMVC, now the issue is, okay, how do I figure out what views should be displayed by what controller actions? So regardless of what view engine you're using, I'm going to have to let Robert Grayling talk about how this works with Spark a little bit. But you can teach fubu to know what are all the views in the system. And then you can teach fubu, this is how I want to attach them. So I've never liked the idea that you use folder structure or assembly structure to force horizontal layering. I never liked that in MSMVC. I know it's a small issue, but I've never liked that pattern of having a views folder and a controllers folder. So fubu doesn't make any hard opinion about where your views and controllers should be in a folder structure. They can be anywhere as long as fubu can find them. So what I like to do, and what I made my team do, is I like to have related controllers and views in the same namespace. You can see it over here in this little bit of our Solution Explorer. My point of view is the views and the controllers are very tightly related to each other, and I'm very frequently troubleshooting. If I'm troubleshooting one, I usually need to see the other one. So I want them as close together in the code tree as possible. So that's actually embedded into our policy inside of fubu. So this one's a special one. I won't talk about it, but I could say views, try to attach, first look for the most specific match. If the output model matches, it's in the same folder, and the view is named the same thing as the method, use that one first. And then fall down into less specific patterns. View model and namespace. You may have 3 different controller actions that need to be rendered by the exact same view, where it's maybe something like I'm looking the same piece of data 3 different ways. That's pretty common. So just match with less specific things and it falls through. I'm going to skip that for time. Okay, I'd like to spend, I think, most of the rest of the time talking about HTML conventions, because I think it's one of the best things we have in fubu, and it's usable for you out of the box in MSMVC. So over the last couple of years, we've come up with a couple opinions about what view should look like. And what we don't want to see under any circumstances is a lot of imperative code. As much as possible, we want to fight to keep out if-then statements, for-each blocks, coalescing operators. I was listening to Herding Code a couple months ago, and I think one of the guests was trying to say, oh, MSMVC is awful, your views are terrible because I'm trying to do coalescing operators. It just looks really ugly. Our feeling is you should never have a need to do that. It still leaks in once in a while. You can't help it, but you can minimize it greatly by being very aggressive with HTML helpers. Like I said earlier, Dovetail made we made a conscious decision to stay on the web forms engine. We thought it would be easier for our customers to customize the web forms engine from being more familiar. But one of the outcomes of that, because we are in the older, cruder web forms engine, and if-then statements, for each blocks hurt much worse than they do with Spark, it's kind of forced us to be much more inventive and rigorous with HTML helpers. And I think that is reflected with what's gotten into Fubu. So the key to our HTML conventions, as opposed to what you see in MSMVC or the work that our across-the-hall neighbors did with MVC Contrib, our HTML conventions are built with something we call the HTML tags library. Show that real quick. It's also an internal argument at Dovetail. I like these things much better than my coworkers, but I'm right, they're wrong. So what we have, make this a little more vertical. What we have now is an object model, the HTML tag model, that enables us to programmatically put together HTML tags of any kind. But do this with code. You see here, it is a very fluenty type of interface. It's done that way on purpose so that this can fit into a lot of declarations in the page. Stuff like that. It also takes care internally. It takes care of things like HTML encoding. It integrates with the jQuery validate or the jQuery metadata plugin. That's very nice. Allow you to add classes, to add inner children, and it gives us a way to represent HTML in an object model. That also allows you to test and make assertions on dynamically generated HTML. It removes the coupling to View Engine. So the HTML conventions I'm talking about in Fubu have nothing to do with the Web Forms engine or Spark or anything else like that. They're completely reusable, or should be completely reusable across any View engine. Just scrolling down and showing you some of the ways we use the HTML tag. So I introduced that because it's core to the way we do HTML conventions. I saw this first come up with MVC Contrib. We'd actually started work on it about the same time, but they definitely beat us out. There are three main things I do with a property. I can say, I want to see the input for this property. Maybe I want to display it, and I want to see a label. And it'd be nice if we could just look all that stuff up. This kind of idea of mind versus body. I want to be mindful of the requirements that I have. I need to edit the contract coverage dates. But I'd rather have inside the body of my code, I would like to let it handle how to edit a date. So do I go get this one JavaScript library and stick it in here, put this class on it so that it turns it into data editor? I shouldn't have to be thinking about that. It's the same on every single page, so let's teach the HTML conventions how to do it for us. Okay. So maybe let's jump in here real quick and start show some quick examples. Screw up and shut this down. Sorry guys, I'm getting there. Yeah, don't put that much JavaScript in the top of your pages. So when I'm starting to edit things, it'd be nice if I could just say, just put me the input for, like I said. This case type thing here, I said it's actually a good example. All right, case type. So this right here is completely specified by me saying I want the input type, I want an input element for this property. So fubu HTML conventions are smart enough here to know that, okay, it's a string property, and I can actually know that it needs to be a drop-down box with list data that's pulled from, ultimately pulled from the database. And, oh, by the way, it's not very obvious from looking at it, this is all localized. So if I was looking at this, if we looked at this in Japanese or Spanish, you'd see different text here. Same underlying values, but it's handling the text. And here's another element. I know we've talked to a lot of people in town in Austin that have used the existing HTML conventions with MVC. And one of the things we hear constantly, a lot of complaints, is that, hey, what if I have something on the page that can't be the exact convention? What if I need to modify it? What if I need to add one more element? In this case, we need to add an ID. A lot of other places, we just need to add a class, something to it, something that falls outside of the convention. With our HTML tag model, all this input forward does is return an HTML tag. Once I get the HTML tag, I can chain all the manipulation stuff to it I want. I can add stuff behind it. I can add classes, IDs, names, styling, whatever you want to do. I can take what's built conventionally and modify it. So you don't have to throw away conventions every time you hit something that's slightly bit special. So if I look at the HTML for this guy, there's the ID that we specified inside of the view page. So we typically don't have the conventions apply IDs. We generally only put IDs in when we need to get at something on client-side code, and that's why that's there. So, would you like to see how that particular convention is built? I'm going to take that as a yes. Sorry, guys, I have to go and remember where this is. Just showing you a little bit more of the kind of stuff that can be done. Here. The dovetail, the HTML conventions model in Fubu. I do have a blog post up about this. I'll link to it again. I can set a lot of policies separately. I can say there are two different kinds of things going on in here. There's a builder and a modifier. So very roughly, I can specify a builder for any property that meets this criteria. You see our matches kind of pattern. Matches and do pattern comes up over and over and over again inside of Fubu. If I match the successor I'm going to teach you how to build a tag for this particular request. So what you see in here, there's a lot of, I'm teaching you how to build labels, build list values. And just to show this real quick. It's kind of a cheat. Ooh, that's nasty. It's kind of a cheat, but we do a lot of our lists like this. I just put an attribute on a property here and say, this string property, it's this list right here. That's enough for me to be able to teach fubu how to build the conventions for this, or how to build the input for this. So I can say, let's register this builder here, this leaf list builder. And again, the whole matches pattern. If, roughly speaking, if it finds if it looks at the property and it sees the list value attribute on it, it raises its hand. It says, I know how to do this. I can build it. Here, I'm going to build an HTML tag for you. I'm going to, go look up the list information. I'm going to build a tag. I'm going to build all the options. I'm going to put it together for you and return it back to you. Orthogonally, and this is one of the places where I think the HTML conventions beats MSMVC, is you can kind of compose your conventions. So there's builders, and there's also the idea of modifiers. So for things like, let's find a modifier. Let's do it here. So I have a lot of different data elements, date, time, strings, numbers, that could all be required values. The actual element I want for them is going to be different. I edit date times one way. I have a different element if it's going to be a list box versus a text box, so on and so forth. But when it comes time to integrate with client-side validation, they all get integrated the exact same way. We use the jQuery validate library. It's easy, it's quick. One of the cheapest ways to use it is simply to add classes and some extra attributes to direct jQuery validate that something's required, minimum value, extra value, whatever. So I can create this kind of a policy, this modifier, that whatever tag you're doing, after it's been built the first time, if it meets this criteria, modify it. So taking an HTML tag object, this little DSL, all it's doing here is, if you see a property that comes in with the required attribute, find the tag for it and add this class to it. Add class for attribute, required attribute. So this case type we were looking here, it's required. So out of the scope of this talk, but we actually use this to drive, use Fluent and Hibernate conventions to drive the generation of the database. And then we can also take this one single piece of information, and it also helps us generate the HTML. So completely orthogonal to the way that we put together the list value and the tag. I can come back from behind, and I can create the policy of adding that class equals required here. See that? Awfully handy thing to have. One of the features here of the fubu conventions is this is completely packageable. So we have a class here that there. Again, it's object scoping, inherits from HTML convention registry. So you could package up, say you're a shop that does a lot of different web projects, you could package up some standard HTML conventions for maybe integrating with the new validation attributes that are in the VCL. Maybe you have a standard recipe for integrating with Fluent validation, whatever it is you're going to use. Or maybe you have common styling kind of policies. You can actually package that up into an assembly and happily reuse it, mix and match on other FUBU projects. And it isn't a one-to-one kind of thing. Oh, you see, even from this, you can see from the usages, we use these conventions across two different projects. Our main application and then our kind of cut down externally facing application. So we've already got reuse and componentization out of it. Okay, let's stop and take questions. So first question, are you using HTML tags to write more of your HTML now? It looks like the sample you have here still has lots of hand-rolled HTML. So we use HTML tags to do little micro code generation of HTML. The single input for, label for, display for, those little simple things. We use a lot of HTML tags for that. Everything else, I think our feeling is that it's best to stay with hand-rolled HTML because you have so much more control over the layout, and it's a lot more understandable. So it's kind of like that code gen argument of, do you try to code gen everything, or do you just let ReSharper do little micro bits of code gen? So I think our point of view is just doing little micro things. The HTML tags model is awesome for simple things, and it gets kind of nasty when you're getting into complicated things. If you want to go see it used a lot harder, I actually wrote HTML tags originally for the Storyteller output. If you go look at the way Storyteller generates HTML, I think you'll understand what I mean when I say that it breaks down when you hit things complex and nested. Okay, second question. What does your markup look like when the option values for a select represent entities, e.g. like a list of customers? How would that be implemented? Well, technically we don't do that. I'm gonna sidestep it a little bit. The way that we do that, the HTML convention stuff for that, it actually sets up a way to do a lookup. So this is like a custom HTML helper that is created with HTML tags. So one thing you can do, this isn't in FUBU itself, but we've got it in Dovetail. Just in case the hurting code guys are on here because they make fun of me for this, let's just change that. So this whole idea of I want to create a drop-down box of something or other. We have in Dovetail code, we have this thing called the idlest convention that just knows how to take a T of something and knows how to write the option for you. I think that's where we need to go. So that's yet another type of convention or policy that can be plugged into FUBU because that's a very common type of, that's a very common thing to need to worry about. It's just not there right now. Oh, I lied. I'm not even sure we still use this thing, but if I did need to show an enumeration of entity objects in a drop-down box, this is how we would do it. I think that's a great segue. I'm going to do one last topic, and then I've got to turn this over and let you go to Hanselman. I'm not sure if we're doing this talk all remotely and you can't see his face. I'm not sure how that hurts him with his special shoe powers or not. Okay, here's another big deal. It's the last thing I'm going to show. So we also have, at a lower level than the HTML conventions, we have this thing called the display formatter. Oh, nice. Thanks, guys. That's awesome. So there's a lot of times in your system. There we go. These two. Besides HTML convention generation, where you have some kind of object and you need to make a string representation of it. So, like taking an entity, you need to do a display for of an entity, or you might need to be putting it into some other piece of HTML, or maybe you're doing it inline somewhere. But the point is, you do have some policies in your system about how things like dates are going to be formatted. So at a lower level than the HTML conventions, we have this idea of a stringifier, where you can register a policy of how do I take an object and turn it into a string representation. It's actually consumed and used internally in the HTML conventions. So I can say for things like if a property is a datetime, this is how I format it. This is how I convert it to a string. So we have a service we call datetime formatter that does the ugly work of go look up the user's time zone, convert from UTC to their own local time, and just do it for you. But we embed that policy in like this. You know, it can also say if the property is date, show it as a short date. If the property name is date time or has time in it, then show it as a long date with the time in there. So we can actually pick up policies about how it's displayed by the property name itself. So what I think you could do, in that what you were talking there about your list conventions, is without mucking around inside of your entities themselves or the objects themselves, you could create a stringifier policy for that type, and then just have your whatever HTML helper you build to make the list, just use that stringifier thing to create the text. If that makes any sense. Right. Guys, I have plenty more content, but I think I'm out of time. So I'll throw it open for any more questions. And if not, thank you for coming in here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of MVC Conf. And you can always send me email questions later, or truth be told, the fastest way to get a hold of me is to ping me on Twitter. Shamefully enough.
I'm not seeing any questions come in. Let's see. Okay, well, if there are no questions, everybody's moving over to room 1, where Scott Hanselman is giving his keynote. So if you guys want to drop out of here and show up over there, he's already begun. Thanks a lot, Jeremy.
Thank you.
This presentation was recorded at MVC Conf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com.